So in the previous lesson, we talked about the Flowable class, and I'd given you a quick overview of some of its capabilities, particularly focusing on its back pressure support strategies. We're now going to talk about one of the key factory method operators in the Flowable class, starting with create. And you'll see that this is a factory method that makes a flowable stream that supports a certain type of back pressure strategy. So the create operator, much as it is the case with the observable create, it bridges the reactive world, which is where we want to live, with a callback style non-back pressure aware world, which is where the data is going to be coming from. And you can see it takes a parameter called source, which is of type flowable on subscribe, and this parameter has a subscribe method that receives something of type flowable emitter. And this flowable emitter can emit events like the on-next event, the on-error event, the on-complete event. All the types of events we've talked about so far that are used to start pushing data, pushing events into a stream. So this is basically where we get our publisher from, or get a publisher from. And using create and the flowable on subscribe parameter supports more dynamic use cases than the flowable and observable just and from iterable operators give you. Remember, just is a way to get one element put in or a group of elements put in, as is from iterable. But those aren't particularly dynamic, whereas this thing can be very dynamic. In fact, you can actually run it in a totally different thread if you want to. The second parameter here defines something called the back pressure strategy, or the mode. And this strategy will be applied if a subscriber doesn't request the data quickly enough relative to the rate at which the data is being generated. The create operator returns something called a cold flowable. You might remember we talked about cold observables before, and these will emit elements from the emitter whenever a subscriber subscribes. So whenever a subscriber subscribes, then the elements will be emitted sort of starting from the beginning again. Subject to the back pressure strategy, of course. So the back pressure strategy mode is going to be used in conjunction with this event generator emitter thing, this flowable emitter, in order to be able to process the data at the right rate. Now, one of the interesting things about this model, which is also different from just or from iterable to some extent, is you can have the elements emitted from one or more threads. So we'll take a look at an example here shortly that will demonstrate this. This particular example is going to pass in a flowable emitter here to the create method. And you can see that what this is going to do is it's going to go from 1 to count, and it's going to just generate values from 1 to count as quickly as it can. And then it's going to go ahead and emit random numbers. So for each of those values, it's going to emit the next random integer if things go well. And then when we're done, in other words, when we hit count, then the onComplete method will be called, and that'll complete the events. This particular example will subscribe this processing, this functional for loop, if you will, this reactive for loop, if you will, on some schedule that's defined here as a parameter. So this will use a background thread to emit these values. And then the values that are emitted in the background thread can be connected up through other operators in flowable stream to be processed and eventually dealt with using the strategy that might have been defined here. Project Reactor has a create method that's very similar to the one that we've got in Flowable. However, this particular operator is interesting in that it supports both back pressure aware publishers and back pressure strategies, whereas the create operator only supports back pressure strategies, but it's for non-back pressure aware publishers. What the heck does that mean? That means that this particular publisher just blasts the data as quickly as it can. The mechanisms don't know how to have the subscriber tell it to stop or slow down. So it only has a way to be able to deal with things using the back pressure strategies, whereas the flux create operator gives you both capabilities, and we'll talk a bit more about that. Java has a generate method in the streams framework that doesn't support back pressure. And so therefore, you don't have a way to stop the rate at which the data is being generated, per se. But you also have to remember that streams is more of a pull-based model than a push-based model. So reactive streams in RxJava and Project Reactor are kind of push-based. They push the data through, whereas Java Streams has a terminal operator that pulls the data. So the need for back pressure is somewhat obviated because things don't really generate data until they're told to. So that's the end of the overview of the create factory method operator in the Flowable class. We'll talk in the next part of this lesson about the generate method that's also part of Flowable.